Hi everybody, this is a look at the Nikon S2 rangefinder camera, which started production in December 1954, and it followed on from the Nikon S, and it's actually got some new features of the Nikon S which made it a lot better. First of all was the frame format. This one is the first one to use a standard 24 by 36mm format. It also has a bigger and a one-to-one viewfinder, whereas the early ones had a smaller viewfinder. It's also the first camera that it produced with a rewind crank and lever, and also the first one that produced with a proper advanced lever. The earlier model, the S, used to have a similar setup as on this Kiev, where the rewind is done just by this wheel on the top, and similar, the advance is done by this wheel by turning that, which advances the film, cocks the shutter. So this one was quite innovative at the time, and it led on to obviously eventually the Nikon F SLR, which has a similar top display, top panel layout. So I'm going to go through the features and functions of the camera and show you some things about it. I'll try and be as quick as possible. So on the right hand side, you've got, as I say, you've got the film advance and shutter cocking lever, and around in the centre of that is a film counter, but on this model it doesn't reset automatically to 0 or S, as you could say. When you insert a new film and get to the first frame, you then need to manually, using your thumb, set that back to 0, and then as you then take a photo, it will then move up one step at a time to show you what where your film's got to. Next to that is the shutter release button, and that's very similar to the Nikon F. It uses the same threaded collar, and the collar has two settings, A and R. A is for normal film advance and R is for when you're rewinding. So when you got to the end of the film, you'd move the collar to the R, and that releases the sprocket inside, so you can then lift up the rewind crank lever and rewind. Put it back to normal advance. You've got the shutter dial, which is a bit different to the later models. After this model they changed it to one like the Nikon F. On this one it's like a dual dial for setting the shutter. You've got a lower one and an upper dial, and the upper dial is for setting speeds of 30th of a second or above. And before you set any shutter speed, you should have the shutter already cocked. So you'd cock the shutter, and you know the shutter is cocked, by the way, by looking at these arrows. You've got the right arrow and left arrow facing each other. So to set a shutter speed, say of 60th of a second, so shutter speeds of 30th and seconds or above are set on the top dial. You have the bottom dial set to 30, which is highlighted in red, so you leave that on 30, and that's moved by this lever. So you leave that one on 30, and you want a shutter speed of 6th of a second, you've got that set there. If you want to change it to say 1/2 of a second, you have to lift it up slightly, and you can turn it and set it to 1/2 of a second. So you've got settings on the top dial from 1/1000th of a second, and that was a new feature of this camera. The S model only went up to 500ths of a second. So you've got 1/1000th of a second right down to 6th of a second, and then X, which is flash sync speed of 1/50th of a second. Then you've got 1/30th of a second, and you've got B as well. And on B, when you press the shutter, it remains open until you release the button. Now if you want to set a shutter speed lower than 30th of a second, you'd advance film, cock the shutter, and then you'd set the top one to a 30th, and then using the bottom one to set lower speeds of say 15ths, 1/8, quarter, etc. So if you want a shutter speed of 1 second, you can set it to that, and then it fires at that speed. You've also got a T setting, and if you set it on T for timed, you can use a clock or a stopwatch, etc. to time an exposure, a long exposure, and in that mode, when you fire the button, you can let go and it only closes the shutter when you move the bottom dial. So that's how the shutter dial works. Next to that is a hot shoe, but it's actually a code shoe because it doesn't have any contact points. There's a flash gun connection at the front here, and you've also got a synchro connection on the side for flash. So it's basically a code shoe, and a lot of flashes in those days were bulb flashes, and you've got a dial on this side which says synchro on it, and they thought it was quite an innovative idea at the time, and you could set up for different flashes because the bulb flashes don't fire instantly, so it had to be synced correctly with the shutter, and you could set different settings on this dial on this side here. For normal electronic flash, you'd leave it set on X. Now, to get to the film chamber, you look underneath, and it's similar to the Nikon F. We've got a open and close key. So you lift that up, turn, and you can slide the back off and insert the film. Just pop the film cartridge up, pull the leader across, pop it into the slot, and advance a couple of times. You can close the back. It just slides into some grooves and pushes, and then you lock the key again. And then, as I say, you have to remember after you advance to set the frame counter to 0. So you've got a reminder of when you're near the end of the film. Looking at the front, you've got the 2 windows. One is the rangefinder window that puts a split image on top of the viewfinder window, and the viewfinder is a larger one than the early model, the Nikon S. It's 1:1, and it's set up for a 50mm lens, which is actually fitted to this camera. So what you see through there, and you see inside a frame what you would get off a 50mm lens, and you use the rangefinder by focusing the lens and looking through the viewfinder, and you will see a block in the centre that you have to align until you get a single line, and that shows that you've got the lens focused correctly. It's easier to do than actually explain, so bear with me on that one. So this is a standard lens what came with this camera. It's a 50mm. In those days they called them 5cm, but it's the same figure. So f1.4 did actually produce a first time on these cameras a 1.1 f stop lens, which is quite big. On this one you have the aperture on the lens itself. So it starts from 1.4, and then you just move it to the different aperture settings. The exposure, of course, you have to set manually using different methods depending on what you want to use, Sunny 16 rule or an exposure meter. I've actually got a little shoe mounting exposure meter which I can slip on there, and obviously set the correct film speed, say 200 ASA, and then I can get a light reading by looking at the needle. You can see that, it's difficult to see, and you set the arrow to the needle, and then you can read off the setting. In this case you would say get a aperture of f2 with a shutter speed of 1/60th. So you would set f2 on the lens, quick shutter, set 1/60th on the shutter dial, and then you would focus the lens through the viewfinder, frame it and take your shot. So you can see it's quite an involved thing for taking a picture, not like the days we have now. So that's with that 50mm lens. Now it uses lenses, it's got its own type of mount of course, but it's a similar mount on this one to a Contax mount. And I'll just take the light meter off a sec. And to remove the lens you have to set it to infinity first, and then you press in this little catch, as you can see there, on the lens, and then you can turn the lens itself till the red dots line up and you can remove the lens. The focusing, by the way, which I didn't mention, you can actually do on the lens itself or using this wheel on the standard lens, and it locks at infinity, but as you go to press this lever you press in that which releases the lock and it turns. You can see you've got a depth of a distance scale on there and depth of field numbers as well, so you can judge depth of field. Now you can fit different lenses obviously. You set the mount back to infinity, and I say because it takes different Contax lenses, I've actually brought a Jupiter 35mm lens because I wanted a 35mm lens or a 3.5cm lens for this rather than a 50, because I find that better for a standard lens. And I got this lens in its case, which is a plastic case, and when you buy these you also want the rear cap with them, because obviously you'll see when I remove this one's quite long, so you can remove the cap and you can see the actual goes quite far into the body of the camera. And one thing just to mention about rangefinders, you might say, well, why would you want to use one of these cameras rather than an SLR? But there's two big advantages to it. One is the fact that they are more compact. I mean, if you look at this compared to a Nikon F, you can see it's quite a bit smaller and lighter, of course. Another thing as well, which you don't realise, you can make the lenses smaller because it can go closer to the actual film plane. Whereas on SLR you've got the mirror getting in the way, so the lens has to be further out, which means the lens has to be bigger to give you the same focal length. So on this one it can basically go right up and nearly touch the gloss shutter. And the other benefit of that is, of course, if you think about it, so the rays are coming through the lens and being dispersed onto the film plane at a much shorter distance, so very close like that, rather than on an SLR with a mirror you might have a distance of that. So in theory you can actually get sharper images with these rangefinder cameras. Now to mount this lens, say this is a 35mm Jupiter, you just have to make sure, like I say, it's set on infinity on the body, and you set the focusing on the lens to infinity as well, and then you align the red dot against the red dot on there roughly, push on, and then you hold the bottom and turn until it clicks, and that's mounted the lens. Now you see it's actually hid all the distance scale and depth of field scale on the camera body, because obviously that is not now relative to this lens. So I can remove the cap, and on this lens the aperture is actually set in like the centre of the lens, you can see, and you just turn. I've actually got a filter fitted, I can turn the filter, I can set different aperture settings. It starts from 2.8 up to f22. And you can focus, I'd recommend focusing on the lens itself on other lenses, especially telephoto one, which is quite heavier. It's not very easy to use this wheel. So that's a 35mm lens fitter. Now the other problem of course with that is you're getting a field of view of 35mm lens, but when you look through the viewfinder you see the field of view of a 50mm lens. So you obviously then need something to help you with that, and Nikon produced a varifocal finder. You can also get fixed focal finders which are just one focal length, but this one is a varifocal one, and this comes in a nice little case. And this is, as I say, it's got a zoom on it from, so you can set it from a 35mm or 3.5cm up to 50, 85, goes past 105 up to 135. So I can actually get different lenses now. So obviously this lens is a 35, so I set that to 35mm. It's got the hot shoe or cold shoe mounting, so you can slide that onto the shoe. So slide that on fully up, and what you do is obviously first of all you would frame your subject, you would focus the subject by looking through the viewfinder, because that's got the rangefinder built in, obviously unless you want to judge the focusing, but you'd actually use the viewfinder to focus correctly. And then let's say after you focused you may have a setting of say 3. Now unfortunately the lens scale is in meters, the varifocal finder is in feet, so what I would do is say that's set to 3 meters, which is roughly about 10 feet. And if you look on the back of this finder, you've got a little setting here which adjusts in feet. Starts off at 3 feet. I don't know if you can see that, it's very small, and it goes up, so I'll be looking for about 10 feet, which is probably in between 7 and 15, somewhere around there. Now you say, well, why do you need to do that? It's not actually focusing anything, but it's actually adjusting the angle of this finder, because obviously the closer you get or the farther away you get, you're getting a slightly different angle from the lens to what you are from that finder. So that just adjusts that, and you can see if I turn it from one to the other, you'll see the finder tilting. So like I say, you set that to the distance on the lens, which is roughly 10 feet, and then you can actually look through the viewfinder and you're then seeing a 35mm view and a correct framing, so you can frame the shot correctly. So I say it's quite long-winded, and you've still then got to get the exposure as well. So there you go, that's a look at the Nikon S2. Hope you've enjoyed this video. I've tried to keep it as short as possible. It's quite involved, and hope to catch you soon.